I apologize ahead of time for how long this video is going to be. This may be something that you want to watch in chunks, but I don't want to break it up into smaller chunks because it is one topic and I need to be able to flow through the little parts of it. We face a problem in a lot of different classes. I'm sure all your professors face it, but especially in art classes where it's hard to talk about drawing without talking about composition, and it's hard to talk about composition without talking about drawing, but they're such rich subjects that they both need to be their whole own class. So I have to fit like a semester's worth of ideas in really quickly so we can at least have them moving forward. We can't really make successful drawings unless they are also well composed. Composition just means the placement or arrangements of visual elements or ingredients into a work of art. This is distinct from the subject of the work of art. Now, what we're talking about here is we're working within a picture plane. So a picture plane is just the rectangle that your picture exists within. It could be a different shape than that, but we're going to be working in rectangles here. So what kind of rectangle are you in? Is it a horizontal rectangle like this photograph is? So that would be called a landscape format. Or if you just take one of these canvases here, it would be a vertical format or what you call portrait format. So we have a picture plane and we're putting a bunch of stuff into it. We're putting in lines, shape, color, lights and darks, grays. Those would be the elements of design. What we're going to talk about are some of the principles of design. So these are general guidelines for how you put things into a picture plane in order to keep it pleasing. And what we mean by pleasing is just that these are general conditions that humans psychologically need in an element to feel comfortable. You could obviously break these ideas if you wanted someone to feel uncomfortable. But we need to know this stuff because we are making drawings, we are making compositions within picture planes, and we need to think about how to do that successfully. So I'm going to get through this as quick as possible. Unity and variety. This is just unity would be the appearance of similarity or consistency, and variety would be the opposite of that. There's just diversity of elements. Most artworks strive for some kind of middle ground between unity and variety. Here we'll see a Robert Rauschenberg painting, white paintings. You can go see this at SF MoMA, the MoMA in San Francisco. It's just 3 canvases that are painted white. If they get dirty, the staff comes in and the janitors come in or whoever and repaints it white. I would assume that for most of you, this is probably too unified. So you'd look at this and say, well, this is stupid. Anyone could do that. This is boring. That's because unity is not very informative. Humans are information-seeking creatures. Remember, that's what we're looking at throughout this semester is how we get visual information out of reality in front of us. A painting like this or like Black Square by Kazimir Malevich just doesn't provide us much visual information, and so we tend to think of them as simple and boring and probably stupid. On the other end of the scale would be an image like this, which is, let's imagine, that's not what it actually is, but let's imagine that each one of these dots of color, each pixel on the screen is filled with a different color, and it represents every color possible that your screen could get, and each color is only ever on there once, and then they're totally randomly placed. It's not like a rainbow that's got all the colors, but they're organized. This would be total chaos, total variety, total unorganized variety. And this may be a little bit more fun to look at, but again, there's just so much information that we don't know what to do with it. So it's in no information or too much information, we're just overwhelmed and we can't make sense of it. And these are very difficult for us to work with. So as humans, as the type of creatures we are, and just reality in general seems to be loosely organized. It seems to have a good balance between unity and variety. So we want that in our images. If we look at this installation piece by Thomas Hirschhorn, he has a whole bunch of stuff that he chucked into a room. Kind of looks like a tornado went through here, or like the boat is collapsing. You see all these life vests. So here at least there's enough organization between the variety that I can start to make sense of the objects. I can see the life vests and the little buoys here. There's a pattern holding things together. So I can tell what's in the image, but it's still fairly chaotically organized. There's probably a little bit too much chaos in the variety still for most people to think, well, that's a good piece of art, that's pleasing. An image like this by Hieronymus Bosch is this crazy image. It's got all kinds of variety in it still, like this medieval Where's Waldo. There's all kinds of silly things going on. A woman carrying a guy and a clam on her back. These people are floating in this little flower pod. This guy's naked upside down in the water. These people are hanging out with birds. So a lot of crazy variety, but it is organized in a way now that unifies it and makes a little bit more sense of it. So if we go back to this Robert Rauschenberg painting with these 3 rectangles and we flip that on its side, you'll see that there's a rectangle here and a rectangle there and a rectangle there. There's like a triangle shape here. There's a circular or an elliptical shape here. These circles turned on their side. There's another triangle shape here. So there's these what are called formal principles going, these formal things going on underneath that help hang together. It's like creating a structure for all of this to hang on. You hang all your clothes onto a structure, or you build a building and hang the walls. So all of that chaos, all the variety is hung onto this unifying structures. What I mean by formal is you have a difference between form and content. Content is what is it? It's a person carrying a lady in a shell. It's a weird castle thing. Form is just the shapes. It's like what shapes are there, what colors are there, what's the painting made out of, what's an oil painting. So formally, there is these 3 rectangles that hold all of the variety of the content together. There's this implied triangle. There's this implied triangle here. These group together. And that's what we're going to be talking about today, is these formal principles that help us achieve some kind of harmony between unity and variety. One really easy way to get a sense of unity and variety into your images is to use pattern, because pattern automatically gets variety. There's a number of the same thing, but because it's the same thing, it's also unified. It's the same thing over and over. So you see in this painting of LL Cool J by Kehinde Wiley that the pattern makes it a more interesting picture. If it was just a red or a green background, it would be pretty boring. So it gets this nice sense of musicality and rhythm in there. You know, he was a rapper, so that's appropriate. And it makes it more interesting. But it doesn't get overwhelmingly complex because it's unified in the repetition. You'll see that in something like this as well by M.C. Escher, where you have the angels and the demons. We really tend to like this sense of pattern. Humans seem to respond really well to it, especially something tricky like this where you have what's called a figure ground reversal. We'll talk about this more later. But if you're paying attention to the white, you'll see the angels and ignore the black. And if you pay attention to the black, you'll see the demons and you'll probably be ignoring the angels. And you can flip back and forth. This idea of pattern is dependent on the idea of repetition and rhythm. Rhythm is just a regular or ordered repetition of dominant and subordinate elements within a design. So what we mean by that is like evenly spaced units. You can see that in this painting by Giacomo Balla, The Hand of the Violinist. Each one of the brush strokes is basically the same size and they're evenly placed. So that creates a sense of time and rhythm marching on. Obviously, this painting is about music and rhythm. It's The Hand of the Violinist. So you see, like I said, each one of these paint strokes, it's almost like looking at a sheet of music, and you can almost hear the like tempo of the piece as you look at it. If you look at the headstock of the violin, you can almost count the music like 1, 2, 4, 6, and the hands would be like 1, 2, 3, 5. So you have that sense of a regular interval. There's some gaps here, you know, when I didn't count, that's like a pause in the music. So everything about this has a sense of rhythm and time and motion built into it. Scale and proportion is something that we need to be very aware of in this class. Scale is the size or apparent size of an object seen in relation to other objects in its environment, or just like the actual size of it. So in this image here of the car, we have the actual car, which is larger both in real life and just in the picture plane. It's larger than the toy car. The toy car again, is smaller in relation to it's a different scale within the picture plane, but also it's just a smaller version of the car in real life. So these things are at different scales. This is called a scaled down model. Now, when they scale the model down, they preserve proportion. So proportion are the size relationships between the parts in the hull. So the ratio of this door to the whole car stays the same. The best way to probably understand that is just to look at a line. So this line here, this line, the larger line is twice the size of this line. So it's scaled up to twice the size, and that's the scale. That's the change in size. The proportion, though, is that both of these lines share the proportion of being cut into the top part is 1/3 and the bottom part is 2/3. This is 1/3, this is 2/3. So even though they're a different scale and the different size, the proportions are the same between them. That's very important to understand as we go forward. Probably the most important principle for us is the concept of balance. Even unity and variety, being so essential, has this idea of balance between unity and variety built into it. It should just be pretty obvious why we want balance. You don't want to be out of balance because that means you could fall over and hurt yourself. And if things around you are out of balance, so these two images here are of sculptures by the artist Richard Serra, if things around you are out of balance, you'd be very uncomfortable. The reason I'm showing these sculptures is these are gigantic chunks of steel that weigh like a ton or two a piece, and they're just balanced on each other. They're not welded into the floor. They're not glued to each other. There's no nails or anything. So when you're around these objects, and again, you can see some of these at San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, and you see they have these ropes here because they don't want these things to fall over. But when you're around them, there's this very real sense of like, oh my God, if this thing came out of balance, it would crush me. And that's exactly right. We don't like things around us to be out of balance either. So when we're looking at images, we want to create images that feel in balance for the viewer, unless you're purposely trying to make them feel uncomfortable, of course. So it's a little bit weird to think about how do we create balance in a picture, but if you think of the picture plane, say there's a big rectangle here on a teeter-totter like this, we can start to imagine putting things on the picture plane and then that tilting the teeter-totter. The easiest way to create balance is called symmetry. Symmetry is just when a design or composition is pretty much identical from side to side. So here you'll see this painting by Alex Gray, Oversoul. It's pretty much the exact same thing, impressively the exact same thing from side to side. And of course that's going to be balanced because there's all of the exact same stuff at the exact same size and the exact same amount on side to side. So if I had a scale, like yeah, obviously that would be balanced out. You'll see even here this side is a little bit different than this side over here. So when we say symmetry, we mean nearly identical usually. The symmetries don't have to go side to side either. They could also go top to bottom like this. So now this is a four-way symmetry. It's bilaterally symmetrical side to side and up and down. Not only is this bilateral symmetry something that makes a really easy solution to the problem of balance, but it's something that we just as humans are really geared to respond to because of millions of years of evolution teaching us that symmetry is important. If you look at this Posterity, the Holy Place, it's a piece, it's a collage by the artist Damien Hirst, and he's using butterflies throughout it. So he's mimicking the look of like a stained glass window. You see this a lot in religious art. And what he's using to make the image are butterflies. And obviously he's using butterflies because they're perfectly bilaterally symmetrical and they just have these really beautiful patterns on them anyways. But if you think about it, all animal life for the most part is, externally at least, humans included, bilaterally symmetrical. I mean, like one of my ears is a little taller up than the other one, and my nose hangs off to one side, like points off to one side a little bit more than the other. But for the most part, on the outside, we're symmetrical. I know on the inside, like I've only got liver on one side, but outside, we're symmetrical. So we come out of the womb geared to recognize symmetry. If we don't recognize symmetry, we're in trouble. If I'm walking around in the woods, in the jungle, and I see symmetry, I really want to pay attention because that probably means something's looking at me and is trying to eat me. Or it's something that I could, if I'm a hunter and I recognize symmetry in a field of non-symmetry, then that's a good cue that I've got something that I can go eat. So symmetry is very important to us. It helps us get images looking stable, and we respond to it just because we're programmed by evolution to do so. You'll see this also in buildings, places that have a lot of authority, because it provides a sense, like here we're looking at the United States Capitol Hill, it provides a sense of safeness and authority. Everything's very balanced, everything's in its right place, nothing's going to go haywire. So you'll see this in lots of political buildings, old Greek Colosseums and stuff always have this. Campus, buildings on campus, old libraries, things like that tend to use symmetry. You can also have, here's another stained glass window, you can have radial symmetry. That's when things radiate around from a central axis like this. Now within these images, it's especially complex because each unit is radially symmetrical. Each unit's also bilaterally symmetrical, and then those combine to make things that are also radially symmetrical and bilaterally symmetrical. So this is an especially complicated design here. I think the reason you see a lot of this in religious art is because it's probably the best we can do to represent the idea of a God the creator that created this perfectly complicated, like impossibly to understand, mathematically complex reality that we live in. And you'll see that here, that we get to this point of like, oh my God, there's just so much going on here. How could any mind come up with this? Obviously a human mind can come up with this, but the more complicated it gets, the more you're getting to the idea of a divine intelligence. So you see a lot of these types of symmetry and sense of ordering in religious and spiritual art. Now, when you're out in the real world, out in nature itself, the animals may be symmetrical, but pretty much everything else is chaotically placed. Nothing's symmetrical. And it gets a bit boring, symmetry. It's very predictable. You got to put everything exactly on the same side of both sides. So usually we want to aim for something like asymmetrical balance. And this is when the image is balanced overall, but the things don't seem perfectly evenly placed. So you'll look at something like this right here. It's not same side to side, but it balances. If we're going to do that, we need to start to talk about what counts as visual weight in an image. So we're going to go back to our little teeter-totter here. And just think about this. Should be obvious. Large forms are going to seem heavier than small forms. Just based on experience, when something's bigger, it weighs more. Of course, this could be filled with feathers and this could be filled with gold and it'd be heavier. But visually, it should seem pretty obvious that larger is going to equal heavier. The further something out is towards the edge of the picture plane, the heavier it's going to seem. Got two objects of the same size here. Obviously, if I put them on the teeter-totter like this side is going to weigh. So experience teaches us that things further out are going to weigh more as well. We aren't going to deal with color in this class, but I'll point these out really quick. Warm colors tend to appear heavier than cool colors. Intense colors tend to appear heavier than like more neutral colors. You can see that in an image like this. If we have it in black and white versus in color, it will really imbalance the image. The red really helps. The intensity pulls weight onto this side. Complex forms are heavier than simple forms. So the best way I could describe this is thinking about, like here we have a totally unified image. Here we have an image with a lot of variety. That would be like an empty jar versus a jar filled with a bunch of jelly beans. Obviously, the thing that's more filled up is going to seem heavier. Now, if you change the context on that, that could change. If the whole context of the image is very filled up, then the fact that this thing is different could make it seem to carry more weight in the composition, because attention also carries weight. If you pay a lot of attention to this, it will be visually heavier. So aberration will carry weight within an image as well. And then dark tends to be heavier than light. So here we have a darker color and a lighter color. Now again, in a dark background, the white is more of an aberration, so it carries some weight, but you should see that this still feels heavier, even though this balances out. If I put this into a white background though, all of a sudden this light feels really light and this dark feels really heavy by contrast to everything else. So let's go ahead and take a look at an image here, the Holy Family on the Steps by Nicolas Poussin. We'll put that image on the teeter-totter there. Now, this is a very famous piece of composition because Poussin took some very dramatic risks. He put a lot of figures over here and a lot of detail over here, and then a lot of really brightly saturated colors over here as well. So the risk is that the painting's going to be very heavily weighted towards the left. But it's not. It seems to balance pretty well. Some of the things he does to help, let me point out, are he has the bright blue sky, so he puts some brightness over here. And because the bright is high up, it also has the sense of it has room to fall down or push down, so it creates this sense of pushing down on this side. You have a very dark area here, so darkness carries weight, and the lightness is gonna feel lighter. So the dark helps weigh it down. And then you have, the art historians love this one, they talk about it all the time. You have this area of dark, dark, darks, and then one really aberrant thing with the foot, a really light area. So remember, aberration, something that's different than everything else around it, will hold weight. So that holds it together as well. Down here on this step, you have the actual just teeter-totter. The step makes a teeter-totter. You have one thing closer to the middle that has a lot more detail in it. So even though it's closer to the middle, it's visually heavier. And then you have two things over here. So we've got two and they're further out, and that would create more weight. But since they're visually less detailed, they don't visually weigh as much, and that lets the intensity of the detail over here balance it out. So we could take away the rest of the picture, and just this bottom step would seem balanced out as well. Now I'm going to go ahead and take all of that stuff out in Photoshop. So I'll desaturate the sky, make it grayer, darken the foot, take away these things here, go ahead and desaturate these images and oversaturate the yellow, and you'll see that this image is much more uncomfortable now in terms of balance. Seems heavier over here. Even with all of that changed and all of this information taken away and exaggerated the yellow over here, this image still holds together pretty well. That's because there are some even deeper formal structures going on, like with the Garden of Earthly Delights, the crazy painting with the people and the oyster shells and stuff. There's a deeper set of shapes underneath this, and this is really part of what I want you to start thinking about that holds this together. This is actually a fairly symmetrical composition above this step at the deepest level. It's split into 4 rectangles that are all the exact size. There's a triangle here between the people, and there's also a larger triangle that they fit into here. Baby Jesus, as baby Jesus should be, I guess, would be right in the middle. So he's obviously the focal point, and he's right above the tilting point, the fulcrum point on the teeter-totter as well. And you see this X pattern that goes through it that's created by the figures here also creates like this X, these implied lines. You know, you could see the cloth, the knee, the shoulder, the arm, the shoulder, his whole body here, the middle of the body. You know, there's just these obvious X marks in here, these obvious triangles, these obvious rectangles. That creates a perfectly symmetrical pattern that the rest of this hangs onto. And so it provides a sense of stability. It provides a focal point, which we want. We want to have a place that we're focusing on. And that symmetry underneath really helps this image hold together. So a lot of times when you're making an asymmetrical composition, you can have symmetry hidden underneath it. And those hidden shapes further back in the composition are very important, and we want to think of. A lot of what we're trying to do to make these balances work is create areas of emphasis and subordination, and then leading people to the focal point. So emphasizing just means making people pay more attention to something, and subordination is just things that will make them less likely to pay attention to an area. And then the focal point would be like here, baby Jesus is going to be what we want everyone to mostly be paying attention to. Obviously, their eyes are going to move around and they're going to pay attention to a lot of different things in the image, but baby Jesus would be the focal point. So what we do is we use contrast to emphasize and subordinate things. Contrast is just the juxtaposition of dissimilar elements. Juxtaposition is a fancy art word that means putting two things next to each other in a way that makes you pay attention to the relationship between them. So you'll see in this painting, A Bigger Splash by David Hockney, there's all kinds of different things that are contrasted against each other. Contrast is just when you take two things that are at opposite ends of a spectrum and put them together. Like the most standard one is we have really dark darks versus really bright brights. Oftentimes in art, when someone says a picture needs more contrast, that's what they mean. But I would like us to expand that to mean all kinds of like putting two poles of a spectrum next to each other. So here we have really warm colors against a lot of big area warm colors against a big area of cool colors. We have big flat geometric shapes against organic shapes. We have very simple shapes against very complicated shapes. So big simple areas versus really complicated areas. And you even have a difference in like size here, just small here, thin stuff here, big stuff here, and then the paint application as well. Lots of flat, smooth paint versus very scrapey, scratchy paint. And that creates this sense of rhythm bouncing around between the different things. Your eyes kind of dance around, checking out all of these areas of contrast. What that dance does is create what are called directional forces. These are pathways that an artist embeds in that dance of contrast that will lead a viewer's attention through a painting. Now, I don't want to say a viewer's eye, because when we do saccadic eye motion tracking, we'll see that the eye goes to the middle and then bounces around. But remember, even though your eye's bouncing around, your attention forms like a stable image, and we tend to move through a painting as if our eye was moving through it more stably. So we'll talk about attention. Now, what we're looking at here is a painting Las Meninas by Diego Velázquez. This painting has a really interesting set of directional forces embedded into it that the philosopher Michel Foucault talks about. I'm going to try and go through that quick. So Foucault says we're going to come in from the right, or sorry, the left here, because we read left to right in the Western society, and there's some horizontal lines that come in here, pushes us up. The vertical of the edge of this thing here pushes us up. We catch another horizontal on the ceiling, and before our attention goes off the side of the canvas, we're going to come down here in these verticals, and we start this spiral in, and we'll spiral in and we'll see the princess. And so you'll have arguments here. You can see some different people are arguing using these underlined formal shapes to argue, like, well, this princess in the middle is the focal point, and this person's arguing, no, this weird guy in the back door here, that's the focal point. And so you follow this around and you would get what maybe is the focal point of the princess. But if you keep going, then you'll see we follow that spiral here, and you'll see actually Velázquez here with his paintbrush and his palette, and you'll realize, oh, okay, he did a portrait of the princess, but he also stuck in a self-portrait of himself, and this structure here is just a painting that he's working on, which if you see Las Meninas, that's about how big it is, so you maybe make the assumption that you could walk around the back and just see this painting that you're looking at again. But if you keep the spiral going, you'll get to this guy back here, and that's why you'd have an art historian arguing that no, this is the actual focal point of the painting. And then what Foucault says is you follow this spiral in, and you get to the actual focal point here in the middle, and that would be a mirror that is reflecting the king and queen. So actually what this is it's a portrait of the king and queen. Their daughter showed up to watch, so you have a portrait of the princess, and then Velázquez snuck in a self-portrait as well. And if we walked around the back here, you would be having a painting of the king and queen on there as well. So in that spiral, in those directional forces, there's a more interesting and complicated story being told. And then even more interesting is if you were to back up enough from this painting to be able to see it all at once, which is called proper viewing distance, you would be in the exact spot that the king and queen would have had to have been in to show up in the mirror at that size. So in this one, interestingly, this is why Foucault likes this, you spiral around the directional forces, and then the painting like shoots out at you and includes you into the composition in a way. to wrap up this lecture, I want to real quick look at these two Simpsons pictures that are parodying Lady and the Tramp and Forrest Gump, and talk about how all of these things come together so that the content, which is the stories that are being told, are exaggerated by what's going on in the form, the directional forces, the shapes, the balance, and things like that. So the first thing I'm going to do is describe the content. What are these pictures of? Obviously, they're parodies of movies, and then if I told the story of each picture, you would have up top, you have Homer and Marge are having dinner, and Homer, I think he's pretending, but he may just be oblivious. I'm going to say he's pretending that he doesn't know he's stealing Marge's food. On the bottom, you have Homer and Grandma are out there, and Homer's obviously stealing her food. He's not pretending at all. So the content of these images is similar in that they're both about a fight over food. The content is different in that there's different characters in each one. Homer's in both. And then the types of the emotion of the fights are different. The one fight hasn't fully kicked off yet on the top, and the fight on the bottom is like fully engaged in Homer's winning. So that's content. Who's in it? What's going on? Form is just how are the shapes and colors and lines arranged within the image to help tell that story. So now we're just focused on formal things. And that's when we're dealing with composition, I want you to be thinking about form. Okay, there's similarities between them as form as well. The images are split largely in half. So that sets up like this side versus that side, her side versus his side versus her side. And they use that central figure in both of them to act kind of as a referee between the two sides to help create the division. So that's a similarity in form. They both have a pretty stable triangle in the middle that holds everything together and puts it right in the middle of that teeter-totter so the compositions are balanced. They both have a lean towards the right. So here you get Marge leaning out of the triangle, her hair leans out, and that causes a lean to her side where it's like she's the one engaging. And then they had to balance that out in this image by having the chef's hat and the Tower of Pisa leaning the other way. In this one, you get a second triangle between Homer and Grandma here. And again, it's weighted towards Homer's side, and you can see that the triangle actually lifts up a little bit where her foot's at. So that it's totally imbalanced towards Homer's side, which reinforces the idea that he's winning. Again, they had to balance that out so the picture's not out of balance by further back in the picture putting the tree and having more details in these windows. So up front there's an imbalance, and then in back there's a balance holding it together. The imbalance up front tells the story. This helps hold the picture together. Now, there's a difference emotionally between the two types of fights that we talked about. That is helped by how the lines and shapes are treated. So this fight isn't as intense yet. So you get curved lines of the noodle, of the belt, the accordion, the roundness of the table. That makes the fight a little bit less intense. Whereas on the bottom, you have these very straight, stretched out horizontal lines, like you took a set of rubber bands and just stretched them out as far as you could go. So that adds a lot of visual tension to this. And when you put that the box of chocolates that they're fighting over right in the middle, it almost looks like the whole image is about to snap. The tension is about to snap. Something else that these horizontals are doing in this picture that's different than what's going on up here is Homer and Grandma share those horizontals. Those horizontals stitch them together, so they're like in the same space together. They're in the what I call world of awareness, same world of awareness. They're both aware that they're fighting, and they're both really pissed off about it. In the top image, the walls actually create two different worlds of awareness. So this back wall creates a square that Marge and the chef are in, and they're both aware like that a fight is about to happen. Marge is already fighting, and the chef is like, oh crap, this couple's about to fight. Homer gets his own little world of awareness over here. Now, he may be pretending to be in there, I'm not sure, it looks like it, but that is kind of captured by having him in his own square. So at the deepest level, this is just one big rectangle. This is a rectangle and a square, and that deep, deep formal structure also helps tell the story. There's also color stuff, which we're not too worried about, but there's like cooler, softer colors here. These are warmer, more intense colors. And there's a lot of other stuff. But that's a basic breakdown of these images using the concepts that we just explored. So we're going to do some assignments where I ask you to go pay more attention to composition, these types of principles that we just went over. That way, as we move forward in the semester, your drawings will be more balanced, more interesting. They'll have a better sense of rhythm and things between them. In this class, also, a lot of in these online courses, a lot of the compositions are sorted out for you because I had to take photographs. But you do need to be aware of this stuff, and we do need to do some assignments that force you to make compositions on your own. All right, I will see you next time to start talking about line.